Hi, this is Paul. I spent yesterday out on the road, and there were a couple articles that came at me this morning and wanted to talk about them a little bit. As many of you know, there's the next big Jordan Peterson fight, and he seems to, with each fight, emerge unscathed, or at least in a better shape. But this is a big one regarding this article in the New York Review of Books. And the issue is his relationship with his friend, who he's talked about in a number of the lectures, and he talks about in his book 12 Rules for Meaning. And there was a big, well, the dust up came with a New York Review of Books piece, and then Jordan Peterson's pretty angry tweets in response to it. And then this morning, a number of people pointed my attention to the Walrus piece. And in that Walrus piece, Senator Murray Sinclair, a First Nation senator and former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, tweeted in reply, "Jordan Peterson is a racist. Are we really surprised?" Now, it's helpful in moments like this to slow down and read and look at things and look at things clearly, because what we are, and Peterson talks about this a lot, we are biologically disposed to react and respond, and these reactions and responses are built into us, usually because we have to survive, and so our systems react, and boom, off we go, and I'm going to defend him, I'm going to hate him, and on we go. Well, let's back up a little bit and ask ourselves this question. What's the difference between these two statements? Canadian Senator Murray Sinclair calls Jordan Peterson a racist. Now, it's really helpful and important if you want to understand our present cultural conversations. Look at what the author found as relevant for the conversation here. He's a First Nation senator. I don't know exactly what he means by that in terms of, is he ethnically that? Is he from a district? In other words, as you keep heightening the resolution, more and more things come out. I don't know him personally. He probably doesn't know Jordan Peterson personally. The vast majority of people reading the articles don't know him personally. But this tags then into the far larger narrative and the far larger assumed ethical system of how this is supposed to work. So in other words, if a First Nations person, however we want to define that term, makes a judgment about Jordan Peterson, that judgment suddenly holds more weight for us than if Paul Vanderklay makes that judgment, as, given my complex ethnic background, my complex social background, but because I'm distant from this person who is closer, speaks with more authority. Now again, I'm going to talk about the monarchical vision in this video. He speaks with more authority, and that's not a bad thing, that in fact he speaks with more authority, because we assume by certain aspects of his person. Now, it's also noted that he's a senator, so he's of high status, and he tweets a very low resolution judgment: Jordan Peterson is a racist. And so Canadian senator, First Nations person, calls Jordan Peterson a racist. To say that says this judgment belongs to him. But to just pull it back to the larger view, Jordan Peterson is a racist, now we are making a categorical statement. And this is where, both in the science conversation and in the ethical conversation, we get into what I call a monarchical view. Now remember, monarchical it's connected to a king, but monarchy means one authority. And that's obviously what a king is. There's one authority. But a monarchical view is, in a sense, roughly synonymous with the objective view. And so what this would say is that Jordan B. Peterson is a racist since the foundations of the world. Now, if I put the language that way, a bunch of you Calvinists or anti-Calvinists or would have to say, whoa, wait, he's always been from the foundation of the world. Now, pay attention to the transgender comment. If we talk about Caitlyn Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner has always been a woman, even though many of us who grew up in the 70s saw Bruce win the gold medal. And so this then is the stuff of the conversation. But when we cast it in this light, and the reason that the Caitlyn Jenner is always Caitlyn, even though Caitlyn's mom, and you can go back to those articles and find that, basically says, I don't know exactly what she says in terms of pronouns. She'll always be Bruce to me. He'll always be Bruce to me. I don't know. What do they do with all the Father's Day cards he received for years? I mean, and this is part of the conversation, because you begin to say, no, wait a minute. How does this work? But it's important to take a step back and appreciate the monarchical vision that is implied by how we talk and how we make judgments and how, in fact, we work in the world. And so if we just say Jordan B. Peterson is a racist, according to a monarchical view, it's then somehow called up into eternity. Jordan B. Peterson has been a racist since the foundations of the world. And again, some of you who have an understanding about Calvinism and conversations about election and predestination, the reason I phrase it this way is I want to give us some vision in terms of how language works and the frames of reference with which we use these statements. There was never a time that Jordan B. Peterson wasn't a racist. There has never been an action that made him one or made him free of the charge. It must always be the case in every possible world that Jordan B. Peterson is a racist. And so in a sense, when you just say Jordan B. Peterson is a racist, well, that's in a sense what you're saying according to this monarchical vision. And now a lot of people would pull back and say, now, wait a minute. I'm not so sure of that. Let's take a look at the hierarchical vision. I'll call you a racist unless and until you say or do what I think you should do, according to my worldview. Now, of course, that's implicit, but we all understand that it's there. And so part of the game that we're playing in terms of a hierarchy is that I'll undercut your status by labeling you a racist. And so when you have a high status person, such as a First Nation senator, and again, I'm not exactly sure what that means, tweeting, so going out in public, and making this statement, Jordan Peterson is a racist. Are we, and the we is very important in that statement too, because very quickly it's like, this is a trick that we do with each other. It's a trick that we try to convince each other. Are we surprised? In other words, our monarchical vision has been clear on him that Jordan B. Peterson has been a racist since the foundations of the earth. I'll elevate your status, and this is where we begin to pull back from this monarchical vision. I'll elevate your status by absolving you of the sin of racism, by your submitting to my vision of the world. In other words, there was a funny video that I saw a little while ago about, does Al Sharpton need to come and meet with Jordan Peterson? And if Al Sharpton comes and meets with Jordan Peterson and declares him not a racist, well, now he's not a racist. Well, maybe he's only racist against First Nations people, and he's not racist against African American peoples. And, and then you have, transgender people coming forward and saying, those activists don't speak for me, they speak for another, who are they to speak for me, so on and so forth. And of course, Peterson has been thrust into the public spotlight because of these issues. But again, it's important to step back and say, okay, what are we actually saying when we're using this language? What game are we actually playing as we work through this? Now, Peterson fired back. He wrote a blog post. He added a lot of pictures. Now this is kind of if you look at the post, you'll see it's pretty much classic Peterson. He's got he walks through things, and anybody who's read Peterson or listened to his videos will find a lot of this. This is classic quintessential Peterson. I found it interesting from, again, my conversation about media that he wrote this, because one of the things that is true is that you when you write, you are able to consider your words more carefully than if you're shooting from the hip here on YouTube. And so he chose his words carefully, and so on and so forth. But part of why he's getting tagged with this now is in a sense because of some of the statements that he's made for himself about himself. He chooses his words carefully. And now there's question about exactly what words has he chosen with respect to his relationship with this particular First Nations tribe. And this has come up in his rule of life that set your house in perfect order. And again, by using the word perfect, a lot of people have kind of kvetched on that because it's like, well, can we ever set our house in perfect order? And so in a sense, with a lot of the things Peterson has said, he's kind of opened himself up for some of these charges. Hey, you're claiming perfection. You're saying you choose your words carefully, and that then more or less sets Peterson up to have to defend himself. And so, that's where the pictures come into play, because here we want to see things. And then he goes into a description about the ways that he's this man's friend and so on and so forth. Now, those of you who have been familiar with conversations about race for a long time, it's become, before there were memes, it's become a meme. My best friend, so on and so forth, is a First Nations wood carver, and he's included me in his family in his box, and he's given me a name, and he's given my wife a name. So how dare you call me a racist? And this is something that we naturally do. Now, I think it's helpful to go back and to take a look at what we're actually doing. In a sense, what democracy does in the wake of the skepticism, and I talked about this in my last C.S. Lewis video, this turning away from texts as authority, and we're looking, Newton looks to test things in the objective world. What is gravity? I don't want to drop my phone because I'll break it, and you all know how that goes. So this is what we do. And so in a sense, democracy divinizes a process. And so for all of the political stuff that's going on currently in the United States, which has had a remarkably stable political system, political instability goes on around the world, but in a sense, we divinize a system. And so, we're in a sense in the United States dealing with this now. And so part of what goes into this is, well, if we've divinized the system and if votes are important, suddenly the court of public opinion is important. And the amount of influence Jordan Peterson has, his persona, who he is in the public imagination, is determined by public opinion. So he takes to Twitter and he writes a blog post, and then the question is whoever can convince the most people, or whoever can convince the people with the most status, because here's part of the difficulty of democracy that Peterson has shined a light on, which is that democracy likes to say that, well, we're all equal. Yeah, but hierarchies have been around longer than trees, and some are more equal than others. So your most ardent egalitarian will point to the First Nation senator and say, aha, he declares Jordan Peterson a racist, therefore he is a racist. Therefore, from the foundations of the earth, Jordan Peterson has been a racist. And so we look for the people with the most status. We look for the people with the most important status in your hierarchy. In other words, this won't be heard by everyone equally. So we will look at the news source. Is this in the New York Review of Books? Oh, even once you put New York in it for certain elements of the society, that's big city liberalism. If this is on Fox News in the United States, then it's heard in a different thing. So you can see that all of these hierarchies are enormously complex, but yet our brains, and I go back to Jonathan Haidt and the elephant and the rider, our brains are amazing at processing these things near instantaneously and coming down to judgments. Now, Jordan Peterson has been in Australia, and so the Australians are all into this, and someone whose article I spoke about in a previous video, we friended each other on Facebook, and see, even the way I said that, I don't want to. We're all listening about status and hierarchy, and we're extremely, our brains and our senses and our minds are extremely well tuned to status and hierarchy. That's one of the ironies of the current debate that Peterson has gone right to the center of. It's that your most ardent egalitarian can only object and be an activist in the most enduring way if they are so fine-tuned to hierarchies and they care about hierarchies. If you really didn't believe in hierarchies, you wouldn't be out there protesting inequality because you would say you just don't care. So in other words, to care about equality so fervently means you actually participate in hierarchy and see those things as determining life. In other words, you can't protest racism unless you say racism is consequential. And now you're going to try to have to demonstrate in what world racism won't be consequential. In other words, you can't really get rid of hierarchy without acknowledging it and playing that game. So now this article comes out, is Jordan Peterson the Antichrist? Now I will plead guilty to looking for clickbaity titles, looking for status, looking for attention. I gotta acknowledge the smarts of this guy who did it, and Nathan Campbell. You know, now, as a Christian, you're used to dealing with other Christians within your hierarchies, and you're used to dealing with a certain degree of low-resolution dogmatism coming out from certain Christian groups about all kinds of things. And so when you see a title like that, it certainly gets your attention. And because of my disposition towards Jordan Peterson, which should be evident to all who are watching my videos, I don't like that. I'm going to read that. This is the nature of clickbait. This is how it works. Now Nathan immediately says, no, okay, the clickbait has been deployed and he hooked me. And in fact, the person who sent this to me said, just read the article, because he had to, because I might not even read the article based on the title, even though it hooks me. And he says, no, but it's possible he's an antichrist, and it's also possible that you are. So don't jump up and down at me for being too judgmental. Yeah, and the comment I made in the Facebook conversation that I was asked to participate into, said, this is kind of like saying, your mama is the antichrist, and where I grew up, your mama jokes were all over the place. So what's with this? Well, it's in a sense the same game as Peterson and his relationship with this First Nations tribe and so on and so forth. We're all dealing with the hierarchy here, and we're dealing with, in a sense, the hierarchical vision versus the monarchical vision. And so this is a framed conversation. You only care about this in terms of antichrist if you're embedded socially, religiously, communally, hierarchically within a Christian context. That's mostly true, but the term also has a degree of value in the broader context as a semi-satanic figure. And that's, in a sense, what gives the clickbait its strength, that an antichrist, are you saying Jordan Peterson is evil? Are you saying he's the devil? Well, so you see the racist conversation over here and the antichrist conversation over there, and you understand how it goes. Now, the article is actually a very good article, I thought. He walks through some of what's behind this antichrist comment in John, and he talks about those who deny the resurrection. And now we're getting into, this is a big debate in New Testament scholarship, how early Gnosticism goes. And so some people suggest that the writer of the Epistle of John is engaging in proto-Gnosticism. And again, my conversations in Gnosticism in previous videos talking about historical Gnosticism, which had some Greek dualism. Now what's happening in our culture with respect to questions of how to regard the historicity of the resurrection, I don't think has much of anything to do with this ancient Gnosticism, but it has to do with far more contemporary questions of knowledge and history and certainty. And these are issues that I've been talking about at length in a number of my videos. But again, and this is again part of the stuff that Jordan Peterson has been able to help me with, and as to many of you will say, yeah, but this is not original to Peterson, and I'd say absolutely, I totally get that, but I've come to appreciate it by listening to Peterson. In other words, the stuff that I learned in college and high school and grade school and seminary and by reading books is seldom original to the person who gives it to me, but I'm indebted to the person who gives it to me because it's been valuable. And this perspective that we see tools. You see, from the moment you notice Jordan Peterson, you formed a bias. And again, thanks to Jonathan Haidt, you know, that elephant has a really quick brain, and you see someone and that first impression, you like them or you don't like them. And there's countless stories of people falling in love at first sight. There's something deep within us that looks at this person and says, yes, that's the person for me, or no, I can't stand that person. Right now, Sacramento is beginning a journey into a long conversation about, you know, a shooting that just happened in the neighborhood by my church. Some police officers shot and killed a young man who was trying to get into his home. And again, what we're going to be doing is it's going to be playing out in the court of public opinions with all of the biases and all of the hierarchies and all of this stuff going on over on one hand, and on the other hand, hopefully we'll be heightening the resolution and all of the things that the city has done in terms of selecting who the mayor is, selecting who the police chief is, selecting whether or not to do body cameras, selecting, you know, deciding whether or not to put the film out into public. I mean, the city's system that it's set up for just such a contingency will be tested and probably at the end of it refined. And at the same time, all of the conversations that we've had about race in America and about police violence in America and about gun laws in America, and all of these things are going to come rushing in to this one situation. And again, now if you look at how pay attention. Now we're getting back into Neil Postman. I don't have his book. I'm working at home today. Now we get back into Neil Postman and amusing ourselves to death. Now pay attention to how the story is framed in tiny, low resolution, 4 or 5 word headlines to get us to click, and pay attention to the frame of a market-driven, commercially driven news media. You know, the irony is that while the city police and the black community and all of these things are taking place, the real winners in this are, in effect, the commercial media and Google, because everyone's going to be flooding to it. And while we're flooding to it, we'll also be seeing commercials. And so at some point, you have to ask who literally profits from these tragedies, and you'd have to say, well, there's some things to think about in that. But again, to get back to my point, from the moment we see someone, we form a bias. We cannot live without biases. We need biases. The elephant beneath the rider works on biases and has to live out of biases. And all of this elephantine machinery that we have is in there to, you know, I feel scared. Why do I feel scared? Well, the watchers back there. So now we're getting into the more Petersonian, Jungian analysis. You know, the watchers back there, one of the watchers is saying, you know, be careful, stay safe, keep your body safe. I mean, all of this is at play. This is enormously complicated and enormously large. And so a low resolution, plus or minus, which is binary, it's about the lowest resolution there is. Yes, no, on, off, like, dislike. A low resolution is a view of whatever you think of Jordan Peterson and his impact of good and bad on the world. And all of these articles are playing on it because depending on where Jordan Peterson emerged, he emerged about pronouns. Oh, he's resisting the application of pronouns, therefore he's a bigot. Therefore he's a racist. Or he's resisting the application of pronouns, therefore he's a good guy and he's on my side, he's on my team, he's in my tribe. And again, it's interesting that this latest racist thing comes out of a context where for a long, long time we've literally used the word tribe. Now, if you go back and look at my Sunday school class last Sunday, I mean, tribe, basically, you bring the word back, it basically has kinship. And so whether, in what group, in what box is Jordan Peterson, should we regard Jordan Peterson as in? Now, as a Christian, this gets into all kinds of conversations about adoption in Christ. This gets into conversations about marriage, because people have long noted that what marriage does is marriage is a way of turning a stranger into family. And so again, all of this stuff is nested in all of these layers. But our bias is formed, and that bias colors all of the other information that we receive and prompts us to express judgments about him. And I see this all the time now with my other conversations with people about Jordan Peterson, because immediately we have, if once you heard Jordan Peterson's name, somewhere in the back of your mind, you logged, you basically tagged him, and then you began putting notations on him. And the first note was plus or minus, good or bad. And every other piece of information then comes through that filter. And this is how we work, and this is how we all work. And there's probably no other way that we can work in terms of dealing with such a complex world. And again, I am deeply indebted to Jordan Peterson and his lectures for opening my eyes to this reality, and not just opening my eyes to it, but in a sense, giving me language, giving me a framework through which I can address it. Now, I want us to take a look at this monarchical vision. Now, I've talked about this in a philosophical context. Now I'm talking about it more in terms of a social and religious context. I mean, we act as if this monarchical vision exists. Just by saying Jordan Peterson is a racist, are we surprised? And I added the nuance, and this is why Jordan Peterson puts in pictures. This is probably why we're going to hear Jordan Peterson talk about this event on video, but he dedicated, he addressed it in writing. This is also the reason, for example, when we got together with our Jordan Peterson meetup group, all of the interest is so often so quickly on conflict. Well, because that's where we look for. We're biologically predisposed to look to conflict first, because conflict is dangerous, and so we're just set up this way. But we act as if the monarchical vision exists, and because in a sense we can't live without it, and we want it to exist. Now this gets into the vision of science. We want it to exist, and in fact we believe that we can regularly create hydrogen and oxygen by out of water. And we can demonstrate this. And so, despite, you might have heard me before in some of my other videos, I'm not a skeptic about the monarchical vision. I'm skeptical about humanity's grasp on the monarchical vision, because actually the monarchical vision, if it's at its highest, truest degree, is true at every levels, because the monarch can see all of the layers. The monarch can see the hierarchical, the monarch can see the social, the monarch can see the subjective, the monarch can see all of these things. Now, we want it to exist. The reason we want it to exist is because we are dependent upon it to exist publicly one to another. I've got my subjective view, but very quickly, as I pointed out in C.S. Lewis's chapter 3, the subjective view leaves me isolated. And so I know that there's a broader world out there. Whether or not I want my cell phone to work, it will work or won't work. It will defy my will. And so will gets into this conversation. So we act as if it exists. We want it to exist. It doesn't really exist in pantheism. Now that's important, and I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but you have to kind of think that through. And this is something that Lewis will get into as we get deeper into miracles and a number of other Lewis's writing. If your pantheistic vision, if in a sense your God is the sum of all things, if your God can't in a sense step outside the sum of all things, you also lose the monarchical vision. And this might historically be one of the reasons that science developed within the cultural context where there was a cultural, theological, monarchical vision that was well established and assumed in the community. And then that vision enabled us, in a sense, in Tolkien's words, to be sub-creators, to create sub-monarchical visions that helped make sense of the world. Now, if there is a being that has this monarchical vision, we are distrustful and afraid of him. Why are we distrustful and afraid of him? And in fact, I think the Bible talks about this and talks about the fear of the Lord being the beginning of wisdom. Now, what on earth does that mean? Why is it the fear of the Lord? Well, if you posit a being that not only has the monarchical vision, the capacity to see at every level, but also the capacity to act at every level, and now we're getting into, so you've got omniscience, omniscience, omnipotence, omnipotent, not only can see at every level, not only can act at every level. Well, suddenly we have a problem, and we have a huge problem. And actually, if you look at Thomas Nagel in his book that I referenced to in my last video, Nagel says, I don't want there to be such a God. Well, why don't I want there to be such a God? Because that God and my will are going to be in conflict. And this is, in a sense, part of the story that is expressed in Genesis 3, where the man and the woman begin to realize this and have to sort this out. And the way that they do it, well, there's conflict, because what if my little sub-monarchical vision is in conflict with the greater monarchical vision? Well, now we've got a hierarchy thing. Now we've got a status conflict. And so in a sense, and Judaism or the Old Testament, other religious systems have seen this too, that at some point, if you're thinking about it, the proper thing for the human will to do is submit to what? To things that are larger than us, things that impinge on our lives. Now you might say, well, I'm gonna smoke and eat McDonald's hamburgers. I don't care what the doctor says. Well, okay. Good luck with that. We kind of know enough now that smoking and eating McDonald's every day might not be such a good idea if you really want to live a long time. Now, maybe you don't want to live a long time, and maybe you hate your life and you hate the world and you just want to go away from it. Well, smoking and eating at McDonald's every day. I ate at McDonald's yesterday, by the way, so I'm not casting stones. This probably isn't a good idea. But then we have to ask the other question. What if no being has the monarchical vision? And this, I think, we get into some of the observations that Peterson has made. Tyranny is an element of this. Because again, if you listen to Peterson's talk about, the top of your historical contemporary hierarchy, if the president is not below the law, or if the emperor is not below the god, there are real problems, because you can say to the emperor, you must bow. And in a sense, in the Christian tradition and in the Old Testament tradition, the prophet comes and says to the emperor or to the king, you cannot get above God. You must submit to God. And if you don't submit to God, it's not only going to be problems for you, it's going to be problems for the whole nation, because you stand in our place. You are, in a sense, our federal representative. And those of you who know something about Reformed theology, well, that word federal is a complicated one. But if no being has a monarchical view, if no being is omniscient, if no being is omnipotent, then tyranny develops, because someone amongst us will act as if I possess the monarchical vision and use what I have to impose my vision on the world. And this is, in fact, why, in a sense, we are a nation of laws. What we're saying when we're saying that is, in a sense, we've divinized the process. And so one of the most remarkable things about the American political system has been that presidents step down. Well, every time a president steps down, let's give the pragmatists their due, that the president acts out, I am below the law. And every time there's a constitutional crisis, and there's a lot of talk about that right now. I saw Jordan Peterson on Bill O'Reilly, and Bill O'Reilly says there's going to be a civil war. I sure hope not. But this is the question. Do the people submit to the laws? And now we might say, well, are they really following the laws? Or are those in power manipulating the laws? And that then is a question about corruption. But so tyranny, if no being has it, we're subject to tyranny. And if no being has it, if there's finally no one that can say whether or not Jordan Peterson is a racist, or whether or not Jordan Peterson is the Antichrist or a Antichrist, if there's not finally a judge, and Stalin and Hitler and Mao slip out of this world, never having been called to account for the crimes that they've done, well, what does that say about our action? And again, this has been some of my experience in talking to those who are rethinking their religious perspectives as a result of listening to Jordan Peterson, that I think their watchers are beginning to understand the relationship between tyranny and nihilism, and the idea that there is no monarchical vision. Now, again, is Jordan Peterson a Christian? I am not the judge of all things. My term of choice has been agnostic, but when I say agnostic, I don't mean atheist light, which is a common way of using the term agnostic. So again, now we're into the same problem of the Antichrist conversation. So Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson. And as a Christian, I say, finally, Jordan Peterson, like every other one of us, will someday stand before his maker and be called to give an account for what we have done with whatever we've been given, and will be judged accordingly. And that then gets into a whole longer theological conversation. But the implication that if there is, I think, again, Peterson, within his epistemological Darwinian box, wants to be very careful about speaking about divine ontology. And again, we'll have to, these are going to continue to be the kind of topics that I wrestle with as I wrestle with Jordan Peterson and the implication. What in a sense Peterson is saying is, if you don't even have the idea, the public idea of this sum of all hierarchies, the public idea of this monarchical vision, you start to lose social cohesion. You start to lose right and wrong. You start to lose even science. This monarchical vision, this imaginary or real vision that there is, this is kind of where pragmatism and realism meet perhaps, that there is this order out there. And that it can in fact be, within our own limited human frames, seen to a degree and asserted and embraced publicly. Without this, all things break down. And that's where I get to the point of saying, okay, now, if you believe that's true in theory, if you're a good pragmatist, you should probably act it out. And this is where Jordan Peterson goes with his act as if. Okay. Well, if you're going to act as if these things are true, if you're going to act as if there is a being that possesses the monarchical system, and if you're going to act as if whether or not a certain senator says Jordan Peterson is a racist, that means nothing compared to what this audience of one, the monarchical vision, sees Jordan Peterson as, that the most important question is, not what I think or what you think or how we pass judgment, but what he is, and that there is in fact an isness that is real and gripping amongst us. Well, that's finally the most important question, because now we're getting down into Pascal's wager, to say what is real, and to say if I can't say this, if I can only say good enough, is good enough ever really good enough? Or must I be pressed to the wall and say, I believe in a being that views the world? And you might say, well, Paul, you're talking people into theism. Well, okay. Christianity is a subgroup of theism. C.S. Lewis first stopped at theism before he came to Christianity, because once you go through the theist door, then you have to ask yourself, well, I have a burden to get to know this this God, and this is part of my process to understand the world, and I'll hazard. I'll go through the epistemological hazard of being wrong, because my judgments are always my own. But if no being has it, and I think this is where Peterson says you're going to fall into tyranny, or you're going to fall into nihilism. And this is where I begin to get into my Calvinism, because all of the evils of the world are in me. And if someone comes to me and says, Vanderclay, you're a bigot, now I could, haul out my, this is where I grew up, and this is who my friends are, and these are the people who go to my church, and you say I'm a bigot, but here we've got these people of different categories or different identities that will vouch for me. But none of that finally matters, because deep in my heart I know I'm a bigot. Deep in my heart I know I have biases. I can't help but form biases, and I can't live without biases. Now, do I want to judge people on the color of their skin instead of the content of their character? Well, I should pull back from that and say I should be a little careful about my judgments entirely. But at the same time, I need to judge. I need to make evaluations. The elephant is going to make it, and I need to, and that's a way that we live in this fallen, broken world. So as a Calvinist, to say you're a bigot, say, of course I'm a bigot. I'm a whole lot more. All of the evils of the world are in me, at least in potential. And so one of the things I was struck with and attracted to Peterson, my little biases, when I would hear those kinds of things coming out of his mouth, I'd say, well, here's someone that I think could understand my Calvinism and could understand where I'm coming from, because whereas I would love to, it's instinctive to defend myself and get defensive against charges, and it may in fact be wise and practical to do so sometime, those defenses finally don't really matter that much. The evil I do is usually not as bad as it could be, and so my evil is not archetypal. I am not an archetype. I am a human being, and so I'm full of all the compromises of history and humanity and biology and existence and nowness and all of these things. So all the evils are in me, at least in potential, but the evil I do is usually not as bad as it could be. But I can also do nothing purely good. I've always got motivations, and there are always ways in which I can't see the ends of it. And this is in a sense why I kind of like Peterson's definition of his pragmatic truth, because we look back now at antebellum slavery and say how all those slave owners were so evil, and the judgments of history will be on them. There's another little proxy we use of God. Universe, or the judgments of history. These are proxies for the monarchical vision and proxies for God. Well, guess what? 200 years from now, how are they going to judge me for burning up fossil fuels and putting CO2 in the atmosphere just to go to the store or watch a movie or just to cross the country because I want to look in some great hole in the ground called the Grand Canyon? Are they going to look at me and say, you're just like all those people who killed the whales so you could have a little lamp that burned at night? You're just like all those people that supported Hitler or didn't say no to Stalin or went along with Mao, or, well, here we are. Here we are. We're all in this mess, and so I can defend myself, and maybe some people will vindicate me and declare me to be righteous. But all of my arguments of self-righteousness won't finally convince others. So what should I do? Finally, I stand before a judge of one, and in terms of what I think, I'm not going to have. The things I bring before him, he's not going to find convincing. My good isn't archetypal. I can't defend myself against a holy God. Well, here's my hope. That the only one with the true monarchical vision is also good. And the truth is, if that one is evil, well, then there's no point to this entire game. And then there's also no escape from it. If you want to read an interesting an interesting essay. Go back and find Kierkegaard's essay on despair, where the man in despair kills himself only to discover suicide didn't do it. You just sped up the tape a little bit. So now not only do you have to answer for all the miserable things you've done in life, now you also have to answer for throwing away the gift of life that was given to you. And I'm not trying to make a statement about suicide at this point in terms of that suicide, people who commit suicide go to hell. I'm not saying that in any way. I'm saying that in Kierkegaard's essay, despair is turtles all the way down. And finally, if God isn't good, well, there's no hope for anything. And but I believe, again, as a Christian, that he has shown his goodness towards us in the work of Christ. And first question and answer of the Heidelberg Catechism: I am not my own, but belong body and soul in life and in death to my faithful Savior Jesus Christ, who has fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood. That God, out of complete generosity, extends himself sacrificially for my welfare. And grace is my well-being at his expense. And he will finally resolve the injustices of history with true justice. And that's the difficulty, that none of us has a sufficiently monarchical vision to finally bring forth justice on the earth, nor even judge rightly between us. And this, again, is why, if you read in the Bible, all the way back into the just judge, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay. And why he says that is because you're bad at it. You're really bad at justice. You're really bad at setting the world right. And this is part, I think, of what we're seeing in terms of the conversation. Everybody, well, this is justice. Is it? Are you so sure? One of the things I thought of recently was, well, okay, everyone wants to use eye for an eye, tit for tat, reciprocity. This will be how we will establish justice. Okay, so baseball was segregated for how long? Let's resegregate baseball. Now, nobody who is white can play baseball for the next however many years baseball was segregated in the first place. Will this bring us justice? Well, right away, what would happen? Well, the resegregated people of color baseball league would be one heck of a league, because the Dominicans would be there. But the Dominicans. See, here's where, as many of you know, I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic. I grew up in Peterson, New Jersey. The race conversation has been with me my whole life. You go down into the Dominican Republic and you start talking about black and white, and you realize the conversation is wholly different in the Dominican Republic. A lot of you, Dominican comes to the United States and you say, you're black, and that Dominican is offended. Says, I'm not black, I'm Indio Oscuro. I'm more Indian color. I'm not black. Haitians are black. Now, I worked with Haitians in the Dominican Republic, and I saw how many Dominicans would talk about Haitians. And on and on and on and on. Can we set the world to rights? And finally, as a Christian, part of what Christian theology says is no. We need a God who will do so. And you might say, well, okay, theoretically, I can fully understand your statement that we need a God to do so, because there is no single human being that can finally establish justice or see justice or describe justice perfectly enough to satisfy the evils of this world. So we need that monarchical vision. And so we have that monarchical vision as an idea. But finally, we can't know, or we can't believe that monarchical idea will ever come into being. We're talking eschatology, or be finally true at every layer. And so we're getting into Good Friday and Easter. And one of the remarkable things about the biblical story is that the stories of Good Friday are told with a lot of symbolism. Jesus' crucifixion, all the Old Testament Day of the Lord stuff. There's an earthquake, tombs are open, the sky goes dark, the sun doesn't shine. This is all Day of the Lord imagery out of the Old Testament. And if you want to get into the debate about what happened on Good Friday, if there's eclipse, go have at it. When you get to the accounts of the resurrection, they're remarkably unembellished. And this is where, if you read N.T. Wright's huge book, again, I don't have the book at hand because it's in my office. If you read N.T. Wright's huge book about the resurrection, what the resurrection accounts seem to represent is the pure eyewitness phenomenological accounts from the people closest to it. They're not embellished with the symbolism of the Old Testament. They're not embellished with theology. They're strictly phenomenological, and they don't quite agree, which is exactly what you would expect from, well, again, look into the Sacramento shooting that happened, and you've got the police body camera, and you've got the helicopter video, and you're going to have eyewitness accounts, and you're going to have views of this young man's life, and right away people are going to be judging him. Was he a good person? Was he a bad person? All of this is going to come into play in search of a monarchical vision. So I saw, for example, the Washington Post piece tried to put the helicopter video and the police camera video together. And the thing is, once you see that, you begin to recognize we don't have enough cameras. And in fact, then you'll see the pictures that are taken of the grief-stricken grandma at the window. And so there's that view, and there's the son's view, and then there's the mother of his children's view, and the children's view, and the neighbor's view, and the views of white people, and the views of black people, and the views of family members, and the views of his close friends who were probably white or Hispanic or Asian, because this is a very integrated city in the United States, and all of us are in the midst of all of us. There's no dominant ethnic group in this neighborhood. And so there's no monarchical vision. And so there's no one who is capable of seeing it all. And so you can say, okay, we just need the idea of this monarchical vision, but we can't talk about its final culmination. And that is where the resurrection of Jesus comes in, because what the Christian vision says is the final culmination comes down to this one thing, which is why, in a sense, all Jordan Peterson conversations will roll downhill to the question of the resurrection, and why this keeps happening in Christianity, and why the entire Christian framework of belief keeps revolving around the resurrection, because the truest monarchical vision has to be the vision at every level. It has to take into account the physical, the biological, the hierarchical, the subjective, every layer that can be. If there isn't someone... Oh, I get excited and my throat can't finally take it. If there isn't finally... If reality... even to the degree that we can see it, and we have to believe there's far more than we can see. If reality, even to the degree that we can see it, doesn't finally hold together in terms of will, in terms of every layer possible, well, what are you left with? And this is again why I'm a Christian. I think it's simply better to believe. Are there problems with that? Oh yeah, there's lots of problems with it. And we're really good at seeing the problems. Are there problems living it? Oh yeah, there's problems living it. It's hard to live. Life is hard. But we already know life is hard. So again, this is why I'm a Christian. And this is why, to me, the way it most makes sense is to have this fully integrated, and to believe that finally this monarchical vision that our hearts instinctively long for is finally true. But then how to live? Well, be careful with judgment. Know that the judgments you express are your own. Senator so-and-so says Jordan Peterson's a racist. Yeah, he's got a right to his opinion, as we say. Well, even if you pull that statement apart, you'll see something. Jesus says we will be held to the same judgments that we hold others to. And I dealt with this in my last two Sunday school classes on the book of Ezekiel, about how in the book of Ezekiel, God judges the surrounding nations around Judah after the destruction of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, not on the standard that he held Israel to, but even on kinship standards they would hold themselves to. And there's this neat little, I mean, imagine, if you will, that God is like a sneaky ISP and put an app on your phone that every time you expressed a judgment about someone else, your phone would turn on and record it. And so then, you know, you die, you stand before God's throne, and God says, all right, let's see how you did. And you say, hey, wait a minute, I didn't have enough. I didn't know there was going to be this test, and I didn't prepare for it. And God says, okay, no problem. You weren't sure, information was unclear, there's religious pluralism, you weren't quite sure what you wanted to do, no problem. I won't hold you to any other standard but the standard you held other people to. How would you do? I think if you have any degree of self-awareness, that judgment day would give you pause. It certainly gives me pause, because as a preacher, the Bible says, you know, be careful, those of you who teach, because you will be held to a higher standard. Even if you assume this standard, you know, Jordan Peterson says lying preachers, yeah, this vocation causes us to lie and be hypocrites, because we promote a standard that we ourselves can't keep. And so every time that you see a preacher stumble or fall, you know, have a little mercy, because we are natural born hypocrites. So be careful with your judgments. If God is judge and Christ is Savior, you are released from trying to be both. Yesterday, you know, I've got this, looking forward to this conversation with Peterson, see if it happens, coming up in early April. And so I'm rushing through his book because I want to finish the book before I talk to him. But at the same time, I always read way too many books at the same time. I'm also going through How to Think by Alan Jacobs, and I'm really enjoying it. And actually, in a lot of ways, this is kind of a parallel book to Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. Jacobs and Peterson are talking about a lot of the same things. And then I heard this paragraph, and this was, let's see, I just forgot which. One of the paragraphs I listened to yesterday was "Be precise in your speech," and I thought it was a good paragraph or a good chapter. And one of the things I really enjoyed about the chapter was, boy, Peterson's really good at lists, and he's really good at seeing all of the different things that are impinging on us and the ways that we go wrong, and he's really good at not. He's really good at exposing the simplistic assumptions that we have, and I think that's part of the reason he's been so helpful to me. But that chapter, I think, was parallel in some ways to this chapter, where Jacobs is dealing with the inner ring and dealing with why is it that we can get together and get along with each other across lines, and we've got all of these judgments going on at the same time. And he's talking about Scruton, who's another book that I've started to read. To this I attitude, Scruton contrasts the we attitude. Not the most felicitous phrasing, I think, but the contrast is valuable. The genuine we recognizes limits and constraints, boundaries that we cannot transgress, and that create the frame that gives meaning to our lives. Moreover, it stands back from the goals of the I, and this is where we, you know, resist tyranny, and resist trying to being tyrannical ourselves. It is prepared to renounce its purposes, however precious, for the sake of long-term benefits of love and friendship. It takes a negotiating posture towards the other and seeks to share not goals, but constraints. It is finite in ambitions and easily deflected, and it is prepared to trade increases in power and scope for the most rewarding goods of social affection. What I find especially fascinating about this passage is the way it links the preference for love and friendship with negotiating posture towards others. And again, if you read Peterson's Speak with Precision rule, it's all about negotiation. You know, we need to negotiate with one another, and negotiation is something that we are left with because the monarchical vision is finally beyond us. And so we have our sub-monarchical visions, but this is, you know, this is what we're left with. And so what Alan Jacobs in his book is saying is that the negotiations in certain hierarchical systems have to stand along other ones. And so we have to moderate them and modulate them according to relationships. And we've seen these conversations impinge. So let's say your father was a racist. Okay, daddy's a racist. Is he still your daddy? What are you going to do with that relationship with him as a daddy? Well, maybe he's a racist, but maybe he was also a good father. Okay, so what do you do with him? Do you kill him? Do you put him with all the other bigots? Do you ostracize him? Do you never go over there for dinner? How are you going to deal with dad or grandma or great-grandpa or great-great-grandpa owned slaves? And you inherited a family fortune based on the misery, the sweat, as Abraham Lincoln said, the bread, derived from the sweat of other men's brows. What do you do with that? How do you separate that? Well, it's really hard. Scruton believes that if we're less concerned with ruling the world than with having a secure place to enjoy the goods of social affection, then we'll be more likely to treat generously others who want to enjoy those same goods, even if those people are very different from us in both belief and practice. Now, if you read, Jacobs continues to flesh that out in that chapter with some good yeah buts and so on and so forth. But both sides of the culture war have been playing this game. I'm old enough to remember 20, 30 years ago, don't judge me, and I'm free to do what I want. And that was kind of a left-wing thing, and the right was like, no, there's got to be order. Now the left, with their moral supremacy and their ascending narrative, has said, no, there's got to be order, and we're going to establish the order. And so, Jordan Peterson is a racist, and therefore, don't listen to him. Deplatform him. Okay. Can you still be his friend? What if he's your father? What if he's your grandfather? What if he's your neighbor? I say, well, he's been befriended. He's got this friend who really believes in him and has, in fact, gone through a very expensive and intricate ceremony to embrace him as part of his family. Well, that's certainly a step up from saying, yeah, the guy lives next door and I eat over at his house. Well, they've had a ceremony. Well, now we're getting into the question of why is there ceremony? And for those of you wondering about church, why do churches have these ceremonies? Why do churches have these boundaries, these borders? So in a sense, to give Jordan Peterson and his wife names from their people, well, that's a hugely significant exchange. Well, is he a racist? Well, as a Calvinist, I'd say, yeah. And so are all the rest of us. We're all racists. We're all bigots. We're all haters. To hate is to be human. And now we're not all as hateful as we could be, and thank God for that. But we're not as loving as we could be either. And it's enormously complicated. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves me believing and hoping that there is one who can finally sort all this out. And so what Jacobs here says is that, what you have to do in a sense is pull back from not only imagining you're the center of the world and acting that out, but trying to enforce that on others. And I think that's right. And if in fact, so let's say, well, there's this thought hierarchy. There's a thought person with a monarchical vision, and so we're going to instantiate that in the law, and we're going to hold the president or the prime minister to the law, and that's going to keep us safe. Yeah, but, politics is the game of, are you really obeying by the law? None of that finally holds us to. So you might say, wow, you Christians, it's wishful thinking. You believe in a monarchical vision, and so you project one up there. And you say, okay. The pragmatist says, well, we kind of need to imagine there's one and to agree on one, at least in practice. Otherwise, the system falls apart. Okay, but can we really convince ourselves of that game? And this is where we get into the question of naive belief, and where you get into the question that the reality that these naive systems of people, the fundamentalists or ancient peoples who believe there really was a God, these naive systems worked better because they really believed it. Can you really work with this imagined monarchical vision if you say it's just an idea? I don't think you can trick yourself that way. You say, well, I'm not ready to believe it, but I think I should believe it. Well, then forgive my unbelief. Well, how should you, talk to the psychologist, how should you then act if you think you should believe it, but don't quite believe it? Act as if it's true. And the more you act that way, the more you will actually believe it. And you say, well, what do I need to do to begin to act that way? Well, you get around people who actually do believe it. Well, what do those people do? Well, those people act as if it's true. Well, if you act as if there's a monarchical vision and a being who holds it, well, what do you do on Sunday? You go to church and you pray and you give gifts and you worship and you fellowship. And then you have to say, well, why did the church develop? Because people believed it. And you could say, well, yeah, there's lots of churches, and absolutely there is. And there's lots of little subcultures, and you have to believe that the one who has the monarchical vision can finally sort that out. And here in our frame, we say probably nobody got everything right, which is okay. So what do? Well, you try to get it as right as you can. And so you do your research, and so you look into it, and so you live as if, and so you practice it, and so you try it out. Here, I thought I was going to do a short video about this. Well, we're over an hour. I've got phone calls and stuff to do, and I got a bunch of other things to do, so sorry, no short video. Is Jordan Peterson a racist? Yeah. So am I. So are you. Is Jordan Peterson an antichrist? Yeah. None of us fully believe the resurrection as much as we should. But the good news is, well, I just told you the good news.